Senator from Kentucky has the floor.
When we look at this debate and we talk about exactly where we should go from here and why it's important to look at the Patriot Act and say to ourselves, how do we protect our Constitution if we're not willing to protect all parts of it? You know, so many conservatives are avid for the Second Amendment. I'm one of them. I want to protect the Second Amendment. But I tell those who want to protect the Second Amendment that you can't protect the Second Amendment if you don't believe in the First Amendment. If you don't believe in the First Amendment, you really can't have that voice that it will take. If you want to place limitations on groups who advocate gun ownership or the Second Amendment, that will limit the Second Amendment. But likewise, you cannot protect the Second Amendment if you don't believe in the Fourth Amendment. There's no reason why we should allow a government to look at our gun records and to troll through all of these. If you think someone's a terrorist, name that person, name the place, and show me probable cause. Do we want to allow a government to troll through our records? The government has looked at 28 million electronic records. 28 million. They're just sifting through all of our records looking for things. I want them to catch terrorists, but I want them to use some ability to look at the Constitution and use some restraint to say, this person is a terrorist or we suspect him to be so for this reason. We need not be so frightened that we give up our liberty in exchange for security. Now, some would say, oh, our government's full of good people and I've not done anything wrong, I don't have to worry about it. You're not worried about good government, you're worried about bad government. Jefferson said once upon a time, if all men were angels, we'd have no concern for having constitutional restraint. But there have been times in our history and in the history of other countries where unsavory characters, where despotic characters have won elections. When Hitler was first elected in the 1920s and early 1930s, he was elected popularly. But the thing is they were so mad and upset over World War I that they basically traded. They said, we want a strong leader, give us a strong leader. But the thing is if you have rules that allow that strong leader to grab up and do things, that's your real danger. Your danger is at a minimum now, your danger is at a great deal of, it is a great danger to us if we allow this to go on, if we get a despotic government at some point in time. You're not worried about good people in government. You're worried about people who might be elected who would abuse these powers. It's happened. I mean, look at what happened during certain administrations where people looked at IRS records of enemies. Look at what's happening now where the executive branch is looking at donor records for those who do business with government. If you're a contractor and you do business with government, they want to know who you donate to. There are dangers to allowing the government to snoop through your records. It doesn't mean that we don't want to stop crime, that we don't want to stop terrorism. It means that we need to have a rule of law and that we need to pay attention to the rule of law. We proposed several amendments. One of them went through the Judiciary Committee, was deliberated on, was amended, was passed with bipartisan support, but we won't get a vote on it. You know, it disappoints me that they are afraid to debate this on the floor, and we will get no vote on amendments that were offered seriously to try to reform the Patriot Act to take away some of the abuses of it. We offered 3 amendments to the Patriot Act. One was on the gun records, and that apparently unhinged people who are afraid of voting on any gun issues. And because of that, we're all going to be denied any debate and votes. And some will say, oh, you're going to keep your colleagues here till 1 in the morning. Well, I think when they're here tonight at 1 in the morning, maybe they'll think a little bit about why they're here and why we had no debate and why we had power to have the debate at any point in time. I have agreed and said we can have a vote on the Patriot Act in an hour or 2 hours. We could have had a vote on the Patriot Act yesterday, but I want debate and I want amendments. I think that's the very least that the American people demand and that this body demands, that there be open and deliberate debate about the Patriot Act. One of our other amendments has to do with destroying records. Some of these records they take from you through the bank spying on you or the government spying on you. They're not destroyed. And I think these records should be at some point in time, for goodness sakes, if you're not a terrorist, Why are they keeping these records? There ought to be rules on the destruction of these records if you're not a terrorist and they aren't going to prosecute you. The Fourth Amendment says you should name the place and the person. We have one wiretap, it's called the John Doe. They don't name the place or the person, they're not required to. I think we should. Now, are there times when it might be a terrorist who we say, well, we don't want to name the person? We don't have to name them in public. We could name them to the FISA Commission. I do not object to them being named and the name being redacted, but the name should be presented to the judge who's making the decision. And I want a judge to make a decision. James Otis, part of our revolution for the 20 years leading up to the American Revolution was a debate about warrants. They issued what were called writs of assistance. They're also called general warrants. They weren't specific. They didn't tell you what crime you were accused of. And the soldiers came into your houses. They would lodge soldiers in our houses, and they would enter into our houses without warrants. The Fourth Amendment was a big deal. We passed the Fourth Amendment, and it was one of the primary grievances of our founding fathers. I don't think we should give up so easily. I don't think we should be cowed by fear and so fearful of attack that we give up our liberties. If we do, we become no different than the rest of the countries that have no liberties. Our liberties are what make us essentially different from other countries. The fact that we protect the rights even of those accused of a crime. People say, well, gosh, a murderer will get a trial. Yes, they'll get a trial because we don't know they're a murderer until we convict them. We want procedural restraints. And people say, well, you'd give procedural restraints for terrorists? I would give at the very least that a judge has to give permission before we get records. The main reason is because we're not asking for 10 records or 20 records or 40 records of people connected to terrorism. We're asking for millions of records. There are people in this room today who have had their records looked at. It's difficult to find out because what happens, and here's the real rub, and this is how fearful they were. When the Patriot Act was passed shortly after 9/11, they were so fearful that they said if a demand letter, a national security letter asked for records, you're not allowed to tell your attorney. You were gagged. If you told your attorney, they could put you in jail for 5 years. It's still a crime, punishable by 5 years in jail if I have an internet service and they want my records on somebody. They don't tell me or a judge. We have no idea. There's no probable cause. This person might be relevant, which could mean anything, however tangential. If I don't reveal those records, I go to jail. If I tell my wife that they're asking for my records, I could go to jail. This secrecy on millions of records, this trolling through millions of records is un-American. It is unconstitutional. They have modified the Constitution through statutory law. We have given up our rights. This body, it should be 2/3 of the body voting to change the Constitution and 3/4 of the states. And we did it by 50% with one bill. The bill was hot when it came down here. There was one copy of it. No one read it. I came from the Tea Party and I said, we must read the bills. I proposed that we wait 1 day for every 20 pages so we're ensured that they're reading the bills. The Patriot Act was hundreds of pages long and nobody read it. Not one person read it because it wasn't even hardly printed. There were penciled edits in the margin and it was passed because we were afraid. But we can't be so afraid that we give up our liberties. I think it's more important than that. I think it's a sad day today in America that we're afraid to debate this, that great constitutional questions like this, or great constitutional questions like whether or not we can go to war with just the word of the president, these great constitutional questions are not being debated because we are so fearful of debate. I urge the Senate to reconsider. I urge the Senate to consider debating the Patriot Act, to consider amendments, and to consider the Constitution. Thank you, and I yield back.